John, are you going to go first?
Okay. Everybody, welcome to the Veblen Commons Award. And Randall Wray, of course, is the winner. And I am pleased to introduce Yeva, who will introduce Randy.
Okay. All right. Great. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start. It would have been nice to do this in person, of course. Other sessions you can do over Zoom, but something like this, it would have been much nicer to do it in person, but oh well. So when I tried to nominate Randy Wray for the Veblen Commons Award, I was told he had already been nominated. And how could he not be? To say that no living economist has contributed more to changing the course of heterodox macroeconomics than Randy would not be an overstatement. He has made his mark on the discipline at both theoretical and policy levels, influencing generations of heterodox economists, as well as non-economists and activists. Doing an introduction for someone like Randy is very easy and very hard at the same time. It's easy because there is so much one can say about his work. I could easily fill the whole 2 hours simply recounting his work. But it's also hard because no matter how much I say, I can't do justice to his invaluable contributions to the discipline. I could spend my introduction discussing Randy's many journal articles, book chapters, policy briefs that have individually and collectively made important contributions to post-Keynesian and institutionalist economics. Or I could simply mention his numerous books, from Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies, The Endogenous Money Approach, to Understanding Modern Money, The Key to Full Employment and Price Stability, The Rise and Fall of Money Manager Capitalism, Minsky's Half Century from World War II to the Great Recession with Eric Tamoin, and finally to the very first completely heterodox macroeconomics textbook with Bill Mitchell and Martin Watts. And of course, I left many of the books out. This is just a sample. But all I really need to emphasize Randy's contribution to the discipline are 3 words: modern money theory. Randy's name has become synonymous with MMT because anything you know about it can be traced back to his work. He has been instrumental in creating a new branch within heterodoxy, which has become the only non-mainstream economic theory that is commonly mentioned on the pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other mainstream publications, and talked about by politicians. Indeed, it's perhaps the only economic theory that has been condemned by resolutions in both houses of the US Congress. It has also become a source of panic for mainstream economists such as Paul Krugman and Larry Summers, which tells you something about it. Randy started his higher education at the University of the Pacific in California, where he got his BA. As an undergraduate, he took courses with the late John Henry, the 2017 Veblen Commons Award recipient, who became a lifelong mentor for him, as well as for many others who went through the economics program at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, including myself. On John's advice, Randy went to study with Minsky at Washington University in St. Louis, where he got his MA and PhD degrees. And on Minsky's advice, he continued his studies with Jan Kregel in Italy. Randy's first academic appointment was at the University of Denver, from where he moved to the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Throughout his career, he has been actively involved with the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, which has also become his intellectual home upon his so-called retirement, because of course, he's never going to retire. Randy has chosen one of the most difficult topics in economics, money, as the focus of his life's work. And he has been right on the money to do so, because neoclassical myths about nature and origins of money have been the foundation for others, such as the myth that the national government is like a household. This myth holds that the national government needs to raise funds through taxes, going hat in hand to the rich to pay for its spending. We cannot have nice things, we're told, and there is no alternative to the neoliberal austerity that has been squeezing workers everywhere while the rich get even richer. Randy's work has dispelled the myth that money originated out of barter, that it was a private sector free market invention, and that the state only played a marginal role in the monetary system. Instead, modern money theory demonstrates that money is and was a creature of the state. The state spends by issuing its sovereign currency, its IOU, which is destroyed in payment of taxes. Taxes, therefore, cannot finance government spending, as the state cannot get back debt which it has not yet emitted. Instead, taxes create demand for the state's IOU by imposing debt on the population that can only be paid in the state's own IOUs. This allows the state to create the real resource space to pursue the public purpose by preventing the private sector from utilizing all of the nation's resources, while spending ensures that resources, especially labor, are not left idle. As the monopoly issuer of the currency, which the population is trying to attain through work, the state bears responsibility for unemployment. Instead of using unemployment as a tool for controlling inflation, which is the current approach to policy, Randy has been a steadfast advocate for job guarantee programs where the state guarantees employment to everyone who wants a job. This is imperative in a capitalist economy where employment is key to everything. In a 2012 paper titled "A Meme for Money," Randy argued that progressives need to move away from the mainstream memes and metaphors around money in favor of a new meme for money that fits with progressive goals. No, we don't need the money of the rich to pay for welfare for the poor, a framework that even so-called progressive economists unfortunately adopt. Instead, we need to use our money, the public money, to take care of our own. We should tax the rich anyway, because they are too rich, and to prevent them from gobbling an oversized share of our real resources, because those are limited. But we don't rely on their money to pay for our public priorities. The macroeconomic policy response to the COVID pandemic has put one more and hopefully final nail in the coffin of the myth that the government spends tax money. It has demonstrated a core principle encapsulated in the sorry, I got a message about the award, so that's why I tuned in. It said urgent. Okay, sorry. The macroeconomic policy response to the COVID pandemic has put one more and hopefully final nail in the coffin of the myth that the government spends tax money. It has demonstrated a core MMT principle encapsulated in a phrase borrowed from the famed institutionalist J. Fac Foster, that whatever is technically feasible is financially possible. After all, we did create a vaccine for a virus we didn't even know existed a mere 2 years ago in a matter of months. What else is possible, dare we ask, if we take this approach to policy? And this, I believe, is the most important contribution that stems from Randy's work. It allows us to rethink the realm of possibility. Yes, we can tackle what Randy has termed the multiple pandemics of climate change, joblessness, inequality, poverty, racism, and so on. Yes, we can take care of our sick, provide lunch to our school children, and financial support to parents to alleviate childhood poverty. Yes, we can take care of our environment to ensure our planet stays habitable for generations to come. We have the tools, we know how to do it. Randy's work helps us get rid of imaginary constraints and dangerous myths to utilize our economy's potential to take care of our own. Perhaps equally important to his legacy as a scholar is Randy's contribution as a teacher and a mentor. In an era when heterodox economics departments in the US and elsewhere have been under siege, whether getting dismantled, taken over, or simply because heterodox economists choose to do mainstream economics, Randy has been instrumental for the continued success of a truly heterodox department at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, the home of many of the greats of institutional economics. This has been essential for the continuation of institutional economics. It is therefore no surprise that many of the heterodox economists who are making their own mark on the discipline today, Pavlina Cherneva, Eric Timoin, Yan Liang, Zdravka Todorova, Fidel Kabub, Flavia Dantes, and many more were once Randy's students. Beyond UMKC, he has also been a mentor for important MMT economists such as Stephanie Kelton and Scott Fulweiler. I, of course, was a student at UMKC as well. I was assigned to work with Randy as his teaching and research assistant, And little did I know that was the first day of the rest of my academic life. Responding to the recurring claim that MMT is nothing new, Randy often humbly notes that he stands on the shoulders of giants. I believe he's rightly going to be seen as another giant on whose shoulders many others, such as myself, stand. A heterodox economist, even within heterodoxy, who has stayed true to his work despite endless critique, toiling tirelessly, paper after paper, book after book. I could not be more honored and prouder to present my teacher, mentor, and friend, Randy Wray, to you today.
Well, thank you, Yeva. You covered a lot more than I expected. And I'm glad you mentioned UMKC because you and so many other students have helped me along the way doing my best work. So anyway, I looked down the list of the previous winners of the Veblen Commons Award since 1981. I chose that date because that's when I started PhD studies in economics. I want to read this list. Hamilton, Trebbing, Gordon, Dillard, Street, Toole, Neal, Klein, Peterson, Heilbronner, Samuels, Minsky, Hill, Fussfeld, Mayhew, Miller, Hayden, Sherman, Duggar, Stanfield, Tillman, Bush, Atkinson, Harcourt, Craigle, Hodgson, Rutherford, Waller, Henry, Peach, Nadler, Galbraith, and Figert. Many of those are here right now. The only question I have is, where's Ken Boulding? I've known all of these that I just listed. Many of them were my teachers, and all of them, I would say, were my friends. That's pretty amazing. I've known all of those economists, and it was because of AFI. I think it was at the membership meeting, there was a discussion of AFIT. Yes, AFIT too. But the point is, it's because of this wonderful organization that once a year, we all get to rub noses with the best economists the profession has produced. And it's really amazing that all of us have been able to participate in the organization. Now, as Yeva said, unfortunately, we have to do this virtually today and maybe for the foreseeable future. I hope all of you at least have your glass of wine. Let me begin with a quick story. I see Gary Dembski here. He can confirm this. Back in the early 1990s, I was riding in a car with Steve Fazzari and Gary, and I had just seen the movie Broadcast News, probably for the third time, because I love that movie. And I brought up a scene where William Hurt as Tom asks, "What do you do when your real life exceeds your dreams?" And Albert Brooks, as Aaron says, "Keep it to yourself." And we all agreed. We felt like Tom back in the early 1990s. We'd accomplished more than we ever expected. Everything since then has been gravy. And this is the icing on top of the gravy, if I can mix those metaphors. So let me share the screen. And begin. You will notice I have changed the title slightly. I finished the first draft of this paper back in 2003. And most of it was about monetary myths. I have dropped that because I think most of those myths have already been exploded by MMT over all of these years. I sent the early draft to John Henry, who loved it, and Bill Duggar, who did not. And that put me in a conundrum, hence the 2-decade gestation period. I hope Bill likes this version better. It's a long paper, and I can only summarize the main themes. The title, of course, comes from Kurt Vonnegut's 1963 book, Cat's Cradle. So first I'm going to address what Vonnegut calls Foma, what Galbraith Sr. calls innocent fraud, and what Duggar calls enabling myths. Joseph Campbell identified 4 basic functions served by myths: the mystical, the cosmological, the sociological, and the psychological. I'll focus on the 3rd and 4th in my talk. The paper goes through all of these. The sociological function validates and maintains a social order. It implies that humans are not free to establish for themselves the social aims of their life, nor to work toward them through institutions of their own devising. Instead, they're working for God, for country, for market. The 4th psychological function centers on the individual within that social order. A particularly cogent exposition can be found in Cat's Cradle. Live by the Foma that make you brave and kind and healthy and happy. Foma are harmless untruths that make you brave. They're Galbraith's innocent fraud. They're Campbell's myths. Why do we need Foma? Because of the immensely complex nature of the universe. The myths quell the disquietude, as Keynes put it. In his 1974 Playboy interview, Vonnegut says Foma comforts simple souls, providing the example of the common comforting belief that prosperity lies just around the corner. He goes on to argue that our brains are 2-bit computers, but adequate to create Foma that help us to improve our lives. One of the Fomas is that God has a plan for me, that humanity is organized into teams that do God's will, without discovering what they are doing. Such a team is called a karass. However, it's fruitless to try to discover what God's will might be. Anyone who might try is, Vonnegut insists, a fool, and so am I. And so is anyone who thinks he sees what God is doing. But that doesn't stop the fools. Tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder why. Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understands. This is part of the 2-bit human condition, to wonder why, the cosmological function of myth. But we're not free to establish this for ourselves. We are members of a karass, and God has determined for us our life's work, a plan we can pursue, but never uncover. These teams revolve around Wampeters. A Wampeter is the pivot of a karass. Anything can be a Wampeter, a tree, a rock, an animal, an idea, a book, a melody, a holy grail. At any time, a karass has 2 Wampeters, one waxing and one waning. Finally, it's possible for individuals to become distracted, to follow a false karass while pivoting around an irrelevant Wampeter. That is, following lies that do not help to further the human condition. These are Granfalloons. Examples of Granfalloons, given by Vonnegut, are the Communist Party, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the General Electric Company, the International Order of Odd Fellows, and any nation, anytime, anywhere. There are many other examples of Granfalloons, pivoting around false swamp leaders, whites only country club, college young Republicans, and right to lifers, the Concord Coalition, and the American Economic Association. That might sound benign, but great damage can be done, as myths are not always harmless untruths. Duggar explains Enabling myths enable the upper stratum to maintain dominance over the lower. And think of the violence on January 6th, 1 year ago yesterday, when thousands of followers of the MAGA Granfalloon rallied to the Wampeter of a stolen election. There were hundreds of good, law-abiding citizens ready to lynch Speaker Pelosi and Vice President Pence because they believed their God, divinely channeled by Donald Trump, had willed it to be so. In America, for many a red state cuirass, the democracy Wampeter is waxing while the fascist Granfalloon is waning. According to Cat's Cradle, there's dynamic tension theory. There's a priceless equilibrium between good and evil. Good societies can be built only by pitting good against evil and by keeping the tension between the two high at all times. That balance is tipped toward the dark side in America today. And spoiler alert for those who have not read the book. There's a climate catastrophe that destroys the earth at the end of Cat's Cradle. We have less than a decade to escape the same fate. Survival is not assured, perhaps not even likely. In the paper, I tackle a half dozen examples of not so innocent frauds or enabling myths propagated by economists, what I call a six-pack of Foma. They are the claims there's no such thing as a free lunch, that incomes are determined by contributions to production, that the government's budget is just like a household, that capitalism is efficient, that capitalism promotes peace, and that capitalism is moral. In my talk tonight, I'll focus on perhaps the two most enabling of the American lies: the just deserts lie, you get what you deserve, and the we are a peaceful nation, at least at heart, lie. In truth, our nation was founded on related principles of inequality and war. Neither claim is contestable. From the moment Europeans arrived, they began a campaign of systematic genocide. And soon after establishing a beachhead, they began bringing kidnapped Africans as slaves. So substitute SMAG for MAGA. SMAG stands for Slavery Made America Great. It also enriched Europe. Capitalism was created on the vast slave plantations in the New World, and the riches came from triangular trade. Inequality is required in capitalism. If all had access to the means of livelihood, none would work as slave or wage worker. All ruling classes rule by a combination of fraud and force. The slaver more by force, the capitalist by fraud, until the lies are revealed as such. Over the past couple of decades, the curtain has been pulled back on the not so innocent frauds. More force is required. Back in 2005, nearing the peak before the global financial crisis, Citigroup announced the era of plutonomy, positing that first, the world is dividing into two blocks: the plutonomies, where economic growth is powered by and largely consumed by the wealthy, versus all the rest of humanity. And Citigroup projected that the plutonomies, the US, UK, and Canada, will likely see even more income inequality, disproportionately feeding off a further rise in the profit share, capitalist-friendly governments, more technology-driven productivity, and globalization. In the same year, I wrote a Levy policy brief on President Bush's push to promote the ownership society, premised on the idea that the more ownership there is in America, the more vitality there is in America, and the more people have a vital stake in the future of this country. Bush claimed that access to wealth would be broadened, but I argued that the true goal was to move all ownership to the very top, to create Citigroup's plutonomy. We soon crashed into the global financial crisis and watched as millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, and their life savings. Governments and their central banks came to the rescue of the plutocracy, while the bottom 99% remained mired in recession. A dozen years later, the US had barely regained the jobs lost, and then we crashed into a deeper recession caused by the pandemic. Meanwhile, the plutocracy has never had it so good. Stocks and financial markets are booming to the stratosphere as millions die around the world. The richest billionaires are celebrating by blasting themselves into outer space as the rest of humanity watched and prayed they wouldn't be able to make it back. The pandemic exposed the fault lines that already existed, both within and among countries. The plutocracy wins and everyone else loses. The myth is that the market wills it, and we have no business challenging the market. Duggar explained and spelled out the enabling myths involved in exaltation of the market. The most important thing that the market myth instills in us, particularly in the losers, is that we must accept our fate. We must not place false hopes in reform. According to market mythology, our fate is due to natural law, supply and demand in the market, and cannot be changed. That's the sociological function of the market myth, to justify the consequences as the best that can be achieved under the circumstances, given marginal productivities that guarantee just desserts. Internalization of the myth by living individuals satisfies the psychological function. The poor have none to blame but themselves. The rich, as Lloyd Blankenfein famously proclaimed, are rewarded for doing God's work. While the market is exalted, the government intervenes, obstructing God's intentions and generating suboptimal results. When Crusoe and Friday truck and barter, they are unconsciously serving God's will, following his invisible hand as they spin about their own spiritual axes, making lightning quick calculations of marginal whats and whatnots to maximize this and minimize that as members of a market economy Granfalloon, according to the laws set out by the market god. Hedonistic automatons twirl around the equilibrium price Wampeters that represents the natural order, resulting from a desire for symmetry and balance, springing from the DNA of the collective unconsciousness, and while sometimes suppressed, never overcome. Not content with free market domination of the West, crusading Granfalloons, defined as proud and meaningless associations of humans, led by luminaries from the American institutions of the higher learning, impose market shock on emerging market and transition economies to free unconscious and instinctive desires, enabling the homogeneous globules of desire to engage in unfettered trucking and bartering with the gentle encouragement of his invisible hand. Hence, what appears to be a conscious act is actually a function rather of biology than a biography. Not the accidents of personal experience, but the processes of nature as invested in the anatomy of Homo sapiens and consequently common to the human race. Interference with the market would do violence to the order of nature, and the instincts disordered will irresistibly protest. For like a body in disease, so the diseased psyche undertakes to resist and expel the infection. If there really was life before Robinson and Crusoe, say tribal society, based on hospitality and reciprocity, it was disordered, diseased, infected. Government intervention, too, is an infection to be battled by the antibodies, armed with the latest interpretation of God's will by the high priests of the AEA. The implication is that there's no post-market economy possibility. Let me move on to the other enabling myth that I want to talk about. We come in peace. President Ronald Reagan was fixated on the possibility of an alien invasion and on the evil Soviet Empire. these joined forces in his brain to spur a space-based Star Wars initiative to protect us from both. However, when he took a private walk with Gorbachev, he asked, "What would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us?" Gorbachev replied, "No doubt about it." Reagan responded, "We too." He was truly moved. We're all human after all, even those Ruskies. The Cold War cooled. And yet, when Earth really was invaded by a COVID alien, as Adam Tooze says, we circled the wagons, hoarded the masks, and then the vaccines, even though we know that in a global pandemic, none of us is safe unless we're all safe. Trump carried division a step further. True patriots refuse masks and vaccines and volunteer their bodies to serve as hosts for alien mutations. And so we've created a world of haves and have-nots at our own peril, letting the alien virus run amok, creating new, more infectious strains to break through our defenses. But we don't just face one pandemic. Instead, we live in the era of multiple and interlinked pandemics, climate catastrophe, rising sea levels, forever fires, floods of refugees, poverty, homelessness, chronic and long-term unemployment, and rising inequality, racism, fascism, and dominance by right-wing autocrats. We face them all, and we face them together. Naomi Klein drove this point home. They're all interrelated, and we must tackle all of them at once, or none of us is safe. And she linked all of this to the nature of capitalism, a system based on exploitation. We're all familiar with a Marxist focus on exploitation of labor by capitalists, but it's not just labor. Capitalism exploits the environment, the family, and the other, that is, other peoples outside the capitalist system. We're taught that capitalism survives because it's efficient, but that's patently false. It's an extremely inefficient system that survives only by externalizing the costs. From the beginning, it exploited Africa, which had to nurture a population until it could be kidnapped, enslaved, and put to work in the New World. It's always exploited families, paying meager wages to the breadwinner and expecting the family, largely women, to bear the costs of producing the next generation of workers. Society, today largely the public sector, has to educate, train, discipline, punish, medicate, and incarcerate the population to keep it employable by capitalists. Society must protect us from imaginary foreign threats, and it must take care of all of those discarded by capitalism and all the damage capitalism does to society and our world. Baumel's disease gets this only partially correct. Yes, we nationalize those sectors with low productivity growth, but more generally, we nationalize all the costs that capitalism doesn't want to bear. Capitalism has always exploited the environment, gobbling up free resources, the earth, the trees, the water, the air. It has never been sustainable. It has always required the frontier, the new territories, the colonies, the cheap labor, and natural resources of the developing world. But we've run out. We've nearly destroyed the planet. Society is in disarray. Even the 1%ers are worried. They're launching themselves into space to find a new home. They'll leave the rest of us here to fend for ourselves. Nations need myths that promote cohesion. The greater the inequalities, the greater the need for a powerful myth. Following Veblen, John Henry argued that patriotism serves this purpose with catchphrases like, "We're all in this together," "My country, right or wrong," or those who lived through the contentious 1960s remember, "America, love it or leave it." Capitalism is arguably the social system so far best suited for war. There are three reasons why capitalism goes hand in hand with war. Capitalism, like other class societies, needs an other to serve as a threat, an enemy to divert attention away from the internal conflict and to justify domination by the ruling class in the interest of protecting the ruled from the other. Domestic others are also useful, but there's the danger they might recognize the real enemy and join forces against the ruling class. Further, too much internal conflict threatens the degree of cohesion required to hold a nation together. Second, capitalism in particular needs effective demand generated outside capitalism's economic system. As a thoroughly monetized economy, where the sole purpose of production is money profit, there's a tendency towards stagnation in both the short run, recession or depression, and long run, secular stagnation. An external source of demand is required, either exports or sovereign government that faces no financial constraint. Export potential is constrained by factors that are at least partly outside a nation's control. And as Keynes said, they pit nation against nation, leading to war. A safer solution is spending by domestic government. However, consumption type spending, including transfers, is dangerous, violating capitalism's norm that he who does not work, neither shall he eat, interfering with the incentive structure required to produce a docile workforce. Spending on investment type output increases capacity, compounding the problem of insufficient demand. So spending must be wasteful. The more wasteful, the better. Bombs are good. Vast profits can be reaped from spending on the military with little positive impact on living standards. Third, but it's difficult to maintain support for massively wasteful spending in the absence of plausible external threats. Hence, continuous war is useful, and it's difficult for a nation to compete in perpetual war without a capitalist system based on production for profit, not use. Forever wars create a permanent source of pecuniary transactions, resolving capitalism's contradiction. 100 years from now, if someone, probably Chinese, writes the history of Western capitalism, it will be the history of war, undertaken to benefit the undertakers. The 100 Years' War, the war to end all wars, World War, hot wars, cold wars, holy wars, desert storm wars, the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on terrorism. War profits the profiteer, and it increases insecurity of the rest of us. That insecurity is good for the security apparatus, but it's a social and moral dead end, fueling racism, jingoism, fear, and an insurgency by homegrown racists rallied by the lies of a lying ex-president. As the most successful capitalism to date, it's not surprising that the US is, as President Carter claimed, the most warlike nation in the history of the world. Counting wars, military attacks, and military occupations, there have actually only been 5 years of peace in US history. 1976, the last year of Ford, and 1977 through 80, the entirety of Carter's presidency. Not surprisingly, Gallup and Pew Research polls found that people in other nations view the US as the greatest threat to world peace. Even the majority of the populations of our closest allies named the US as the greatest threat to their own nation. That was before Trump. So we've met the enemy, and he is us. Half of America detests the other half. Americans routinely see each other, not Russia or China, as their country's gravest enemy. In 2018, a plurality of Democrats said that the world leader who posed the greatest threat to peace and security to the US was Donald Trump. A large majority of Republicans openly oppose basic democratic principles and are preparing for insurrection, should they lose the next presidential election. Retired Major General Paul Eaton worries that the US military might participate in a coup. Republicans are armed to death, armed to the teeth. Guns are prized for home protection against an imaginary threat of marauding Antifa and BLM rioters, but more often used for suicide or by white males to threaten or murder their female partners. Paraphrasing the Bible, President Lincoln warned, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. A divided America cannot deal with domestic challenges, much less rise to global challenges. When the Berlin Wall fell, we were forewarned by the Soviet Union's chief Americanist, Georgy Arbatov, that we'd miss the Cold War. We're going to do a terrible thing to you. We're going to deprive you of an enemy. To have a really good empire, you have to have a really evil empire. I cannot imagine that we will play this game again, and without us, you cannot play it either. Since the 2016 presidential convention, the Democratic presidential convention, which was extremely scary, Democrats have been desperately trying to keep the war economy pumping along by declaring Russia and China as rogue enemy nations. We need the foreign threat. However, the Chinese social system, which profits without war, may be too different to play the game of good versus evil. So Presidents Biden and Putin have tried to reboot the Cold War to keep their grossly inequitable economies pumping along. But as Arbatov predicted, this isn't likely to work. Russians are less fearful of America than are our closest allies. And Americans fear each other more than they fear the Ruskies. Vonnegut posed an alternative to manufactured enemies. What people are lacking is a sense of community. He recommended random assignment of people into government-issued extended families. Each would be based on a false karas, following a group identity based on some irrelevant or artificial shared experience. Best to provide them with one than to let them choose their own. Use frauds and put humankind in the center of the universe so that people stop treating each other like garbage. Teach people that their own culture is not a rational invention. There are thousands of others that work pretty well. Most humans are never going to leave the solar system, so we have to build our utopia here. Seek socialism, because free enterprise is too hard on the old, the sick, and the shy. And that we need better lies, noble lies, innocent frauds, and serviceable myths that are up to the task of bettering the human condition. Now, I don't recount Vonnegut's proposal as a path we should pursue, but rather to recognize the focus on building community, finding a way to reach out to one another, building new myths that enable cooperation and care for one another in extended families. Skidelsky has written on Keynes's ethics and morals, which I see as a prelude to a treatise on the failure of Western capitalism. For Keynes, good behavior is not self-seeking, rational endeavor, but action that contributes to good states of mind. Capitalism is neither moral nor amoral, it is immoral. As John Henry insisted, capitalism can be justified only if it delivers the goods. For the vast majority of humanity, it does not, at least not anymore. It has become a retrograde, degenerate system. The problem, according to Keynes, is the love of money, the root of all evil, which is morally and economically inefficient. While it drives capitalism, which helps to provide the material comfort to live wisely, agreeably, and well, it's also a neurosis, because there can never be a point of satiation. The fetish for liquidity plus inequality generate chronic demand gaps and unemployment. Skidelsky relates this to the global financial crisis, and we could add to its aftermath and on through the pandemic. Financialization elevated the love of money as the only worthwhile pursuit. Today, wealth increase is the only goal Western society has to offer. Because its only goal is to make societies richer, capitalism has to be more successful than any rival economic system in order to survive. In his later book, he asks the question, how much is enough? And answers with a quote from Epicurus, nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little. For the vampire, blood-sucking squids of Wall Street, 99% of everything will never be enough for the 1%. We tolerated or even praised the neuroses of our capitalists because they gave us jobs so that we could produce the things that improved our lives. We now stand on the precipice of nothing less than extinction. Perhaps there's an alternative to Western capitalism. We're seeing the beginning of what might be successful experiments scattered around South America, but mostly in Asia. Capitalisms that offer other versions of Minsky's 57 varieties of capitalism. They have heavy state involvement, but are not based on war and money, love that turns economic affairs over to Wall Street. While far from perfect, these offer some hope that as Western capitalism continues on its path to final destruction, we can look forward to peaceful economic possibilities for our grandchildren, as Keynes put it. Or as Skidelsky says, what we need is a system that promotes human desires that are indeed desirable, not one that rewards humanity's most destructive impulses. Thank you. I don't know what we do now.
We entertain questions
Oh, okay.
or comments. Anybody? I'm reminded of something Schumpeter once said that's always haunted me because I think it's valid, that pessimism is intellectually more interesting than optimism.
Well, I tried to close on an optimistic note.
You did. You did.
It is tough given the short timeline that we have left.
Anybody? It was an excellent talk, Randy, and a well-deserved award, and very thoughtful. Thank you for your comments. There's a lot to chew on there. Anybody at all have any response?
Yes, I have a question for Professor Wray. So I'm curious to know, given your talk and your work, how does MMT contribute to the transformation of capitalism?
I'm not sure that it really does. It makes some things easier. As Yeva was explaining, we know that affordability is not our problem, whether we're talking about resolving inequality, dealing with the health pandemic, dealing with the other pandemics that I listed. The problem is not affordability. That's the usual objection that is raised immediately. And what we've tried to do is expose that as something that is completely false. Now, that doesn't make any of this easy. Okay, it resolves one problem. It doesn't resolve the political problem at all. And just exposing those, the financial constraints arguments as false, as lies, even by itself doesn't break through, because we've seen backstepping with the Biden administration. After $5 trillion of spending without pay-fors, he retreated to pay-fors. This is a huge problem, still, the financial problem. And then the political problem has gotten much worse since the last election. So I don't know the answer to that. It's not easy.
James, did you have a question?
Well, I first of all just wanted to say congratulations, Randy, and thank you for this moving and also very cheerful discussion with me. I mean, it's a real highly deserved honor that you've been given. You've done an enormous amount of work to expose the myths and the frauds, innocent and otherwise, that have obscured the capacity or the possibility of achieving things that need to be achieved over many, many years. So this is very important. The question I would have is, is whether the category of capitalism as such is the most useful way to think about this. It may be a very useful way of encapsulating things, but there's an alternative perspective which would hold that there was a period in American history when the country was capable of setting goals and achieving them, and that for reasons that might be described as the rise of neoliberalism in the capitalism framework, that this capacity was basically dismantled. And one could argue that elsewhere in the world, and you mentioned Latin America, but I'm going to put it on the table to you that it's true of China and true of Russia. That there are countries and systems which have, they have elements of capitalism and elements of other systems, but that are, in fact, you can see that they're achieving certain goals that are of dramatic consequence for the populations of those countries. And the main thing that they have reduced is the burden of militarism. The burden, you spoke a lot, and I think very effectively about the subject of war. But the reality is that there's one country that spends 770 billion on its military, and the next one is in the order of less than a tenth of that. And most of that is, purely, it's purely, in fact, in both cases, purely internal, and therefore of a very much lighter burden on the larger society. And so it strikes me that perhaps what we have are the problems are specifically the problems of financial capitalism and militarism, and those problems, if they're focused on, I don't say they can be overcome, but it might be better, it might be easier.
Yeah, I had jotted down financialization and militarism. These are, I think, the two big problems we face. So, as I tried to make clear, permanent war, the U.S. has been a permanent war, but the role of the military has changed a great deal, where the military is, not only the military industrial complex, not only is producing the weapons, but they're making the decisions. They are conducting the wars, and that is a change. The relative weight in the whole decision-making process has shifted to the private sector. That is a big problem. And financialization. The last time the economy was financialized to anything like the extent that we have now was during the period of finance capitalism, and it collapsed. And I don't think that it's too surprising that when we came out of World War II, the kind of capitalism we had was a much more progressive kind of capitalism, because finance had been put into its place. what I have argued, I think it's true. It's very hard to prove and make the case, is that financialization of the economy is the natural tendency of capitalism. Veblen's theory of business enterprise and so on. I think there's a natural tendency for finance to take over. And so what you have to do is put that back in its place. You mentioned China, and China occasionally does that. Occasionally, they have to put finance back into its place, make it serve the economy instead of making the economy serve finance. And I think that that is part of the answer of how you get to one of those kinds of capitalisms that can be progressive.
Other comments or questions?
Oh, I see a chat question. Let's see if I can read it. Because the 1% is leaving, are they going to a tax heaven? Well, ProPublica has shown us what they do. So yes, they can move to tax havens, but they can also just make sure that they don't have any income. So that is the big trick they use now. They don't have any income, they are debtors. And so they don't have to pay any taxes.
Okay, I think there was another question in the chat.
Oh, didn't see it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful speech. This is from Gary Dembski. Is socialism that we are looking toward now as what we can pass along to our grandchildren?
Well, I would, to be clear, I was quoting Vonnegut. That Vonnegut was a socialist. And by the way, Vonnegut also was an atheist. So there's lots of invocation of God, but Vonnegut was not religious. Anyway, I think that some form of democratic socialism is what we should aim for. Yes, I do think so. Exactly what that means, I don't know. But I think Veblen put it very well, saying that free enterprise just doesn't work for a huge part of the population. And we need more than just a safety net. We need a system that allows everybody to participate fully in the economy, in society, sorry, not the economy, in society. A society in which everyone can participate, and a safety net added to the kind of capitalism we have does not do that.
Okay, here's another question in the
Okay.
MMT aims at a relevant understanding of the capitalist societal economic dynamics to understand things as to go in search of their change, if I may say so. I'm not sure we've been able to leave anything clean, at least so far, to our children. A wink to Gary. So I suppose that's more of a comment than a question from Farag.
Yes. The science is all there now. There is no question that what we are doing is completely unsustainable. We need major changes, and we need major changes to the way that we do things in the United States and in each country individually. These cannot be accomplished by the private sector, but moreover, it requires international cooperation, which again is something the private sector cannot do. So we need a much bigger role for the government to play in getting us onto some kind of sustainable path. And we need cooperation internationally to be able to do this. I'm sure there are people here in the audience who are much better at talking about these topics than I am. I can help explain how to pay for it, but exactly how we're going to go about reversing the climate catastrophe that we already face is better left to science.
Anybody else? Oh, excuse me, Heather, please.
Hi, oh, sure. Hi, Randy. So nice to see you and congratulations. I was a student of Randy's back in the late 1980s before he went to UMKC. I have been trying to keep up with all of your prolific writing, and I think this award is so well deserved. And it was Randy who took me to my first academic conference as well, which was the American Evolutionary, it was AE, so that was great. So thank you, kind of full circle here in a way. But I think my question for you would be, you know, reading about how people are perceiving inflation right now. And I would also say that, you know, when we talk about financialization of the military industrial complex, you know, financialization of labor relations has been fairly complete worldwide, or at least tending that way. And I have to say that I just recently taught global labor relations again, and the difference between kind of when I first taught it and first studied it 20 years ago or something like that, and now is really quite shocking around the world. So I guess my question, and you know, we're seeing inflation around the world as well, and there's a lot of debate still about whether this is, you know, a long-standing trend or not. But regardless, it's always kind of making workers very nervous. And so I'm wondering how you're perceiving that in terms of, you know, are we just looking at political exploitation here, or is this a really severe problem? And how would MMT address it right now?
Yeah. So this is an unusual inflation because you know, we were running along with pretty close to zero inflation, and then suddenly the supply side is hit and shut down. The demand shock came because of the supply side shock. So that's very unusual. We've had supply side shocks before, OPEC and so on, but people could still go to work. So this time, people couldn't go to work, and so demand had a huge shock too. Then we had the 5 trillion, and it was, the spending did not take the form that we recommended. Yeva and I wrote a piece early on that MMT in general was pushing for, which is targeted spending. What we wanted was support for the people who actually lost their jobs, who were missing mortgage payments and unable to pay other bills. Targeted spending would have made a lot more sense. So from the very beginning, we were worried that it could lead to temporary inflation. Now that didn't happen in the first couple of rounds because people were paying down bills, and those of us who did not lose any paychecks socked away more savings. As confidence built back up, we started spending. But the spending is very focused on the kinds of things that Amazon will bring to your door. And so the inflation pressures from spending are concentrated on very particular parts of the economy. Then we have OPEC and Russia, deciding to take advantage of the opportunity to push up oil prices, in part because sales had been low and they started to recover. So oil prices go up, and when oil prices go up, those feed through into everything. I would say both of those kinds of spending, the temporary burst of purchases of stuff that can be delivered to your house, plus spending on rising oil prices, would have led to a bump up of prices, but not to sustained inflation. Then we have the disruption of the supply chains, and we have exercise of monopoly power on the pricing of a wide range of products. So the price pressures have continued a lot longer than I thought that they would, and are more politically dangerous than I expected them to be. Still, I think that the prospects are that the pressures are going to gradually dissipate. And it looks like OPEC has probably reached the limit of what they can do in terms of raising prices. And wages are starting to rise, but it seems to be pretty much limited to the very bottom end. Low paid, dangerous work is getting wage boosts, which is good. So it doesn't look like we have much potential for a general wage price inflation. That doesn't mean that it's not a political problem, with elections coming up pretty soon and Democrats getting the unearned blame for the inflation. The Fed was patient for a long time, and even though I don't think they know what they're doing at all, we have a recent policy brief at the Levy Institute, but even inside the Fed, you have Fed researchers also saying the Fed doesn't know what it's doing. But it's lost its patience, and it's going to start raising interest rates. Those rising interest rates will do no good. Rising interest rates will do no good because, if anything, what we want is more investment spending, more borrowing to finance investment. So it doesn't help the supply side. And then it's going to start increasing government spending on interest, which will add income into the economy rather than taking spending out, and going to add to all of the worries about the budget deficits and the growth of the debt ratio. So I think the Fed's likely move is not going to help, and probably going to make things worse politically and potentially even with regard to recovery of the supply side.
Mario, you had a question?
Yeah, actually, again, congratulations, Randy, for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think you mentioned yourself that when you refer to that whole list of others who had since 1980 or 81 received the award, you're standing on the shoulders of these giants. And it's interesting, of course, that you had been a student of both, Hyman Minsky and John Henry. And however, as I listened to you, I thought it was mostly John Henry that I was hearing, okay, and far less of Hyman Minsky. Am I correct in that?
Well, definitely that is true for this talk, and. Yeah, these are things that I have not written much on. That is true. I did focus on money. and on financial instability. So the majority of my previous work was more standing on the shoulders of Minsky. I see MMT as standing on the shoulders of Minsky. Not all of the people who contributed to MMT view Minsky's contributions in the same way that I do. But I was his student, and virtually every idea that we have come up with, I heard first from Minsky. Minsky didn't put them together, I think, as well as we have done, but they were all there in embryo. So I think MMT really came out of Minsky, and most of the other work that I did was related to that. But yes, John Henry, I think I've said it before, probably in the memorial to John, that John influenced my view of the world much more than anyone else. So yes, it was John who shaped my worldview more than Minsky did. My politics were always much closer to John's than to Hyman's. Hyman was, a good liberal Democrat who would purposely upset me by saying things like, by arguing against welfare, arguing against food stamps, and appearing to be politically conservative. I didn't realize until after his death that actually, there was real meat behind that. He much preferred jobs over welfare. But he did like to try to get my goat by going after welfare and sounding something like President Reagan. And I mentioned Ken Boulding, who did the same thing. He liked to really upset liberals. Probably you were there at the first post-Keynesian conference that Paul Davidson organized in Gatlinburg. And we were standing there in the hotel, which, if I remember right, was sort of round, and we're looking out the windows at all of the smoke of the Smoky Mountains. And Ken Boulding pointed to that and said, "Look at that, all that pollution from the trees. Trees are the worst polluters on earth."
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, well, Randy, thank you for a wonderful, insightful, inspiring talk. And I look forward to seeing the rest of you all at the other sessions. So thank you very much. A well-deserved award. Thank you all.
There is a question in the chat. Oh.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
there's a-
apologies. Okay, one more
Yeah.
question.
And somebody else's hand just went up, John.
Oh, okay. Well, let's let it continue then.
Okay. I think I
Howard
did.
Stein, you pointed out
Yeah.
the collapse. You can read that, okay?
I saw it when it popped up. Okay, Howard. Yeah, well, so just carrying on from what Minsky said, the first finance capitalism failed in 1929. And rather than rebooting it, we replaced it with the kind of capitalism that Jamie was talking about. We replaced it with the New Deal form of capitalism. Europe did something similar. And that kind of capitalism was successful for half of a century. Minsky was warning in the late 50s that the system was evolving. And he, of course, then predicted that financial crises would return. And later in his life, beginning in the late 80s, he returned to a stages approach to capitalism and argued that we had entered a new kind of capitalism by the early 1980s that he called money manager capitalism. So what we needed to do in the global financial crisis was to follow the example of Roosevelt, replace finance capitalism with a better capitalism. That is, unfortunately, that is not what Obama did. And instead we propped them up and patted them on their little bottoms and told them to go back and do what they'd been doing. And that's exactly what they did. I think the lesson we learned, which was predictable, is that you had to take advantage of the crisis in order to make the changes. You can sort of understand the Obama administration's position. Obama was told that, I think it was on a Friday, Monday morning, we will have no financial system. And he believed that, probably. You know, but that was completely false. We would have lost all the big banks. Goodbye and good riddance. We still had thousands of small banks. We would have been fine. So have we learned that lesson? I don't think so. It would be touch and go. When this bubble bursts, and when President Biden or President Trump has to face the bursting of this bubble, they may well do what Biden did. Because I think a lot of people see that as a successful resolution, which it wasn't. Anyway, sorry. Was there another one? I didn't see the other one.
Somebody popped up briefly. I don't know if they took their hand back down, John.
Oh,
I don't see.
Yeah, I did want to say, John, or Randy, congratulations on the award. I really appreciated your talk. It definitely touched on a lot of the things that I think more about in terms of culture and an anthropological understanding of the mythologies that we live under. So I really appreciated that. I am glad your last comments there answered the question. I wanted to have your sort of take on what our response to the Great Recession was, the financial collapse, and I entirely agree with that assessment that you have there. And I did spend a little time. I had thought I thought you had found an error on the AFI list of Veblen Commons Awards winner, but I'm afraid I'm unable to locate a Veblen Commons address from Boulding. He did receive the Ayers Scholar Award in 1978, but so I think you pointed out something there, and I'm sorry he's not on the list, and I'm glad you are.
thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, with that, we'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Randy, and thank you all for participating.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye.